The Soviet version of World War II history is almost entirely false, starting with the very term Great Patriotic War, which was invented to cover up Stalin and Hitler's dealings in the late 1930s. For decades, hundreds of Soviet historians were not just falsifying history, they were literally creating a new reality, which was then hammered into the minds of citizens by writers, directors, poets, and journalists. This virtual reality is built on numerous fabrications, some of which appeared during the war itself. Today, we will try to debunk one of these myths. The story of the 28 Panfilov soldiers who defended Moscow is known to almost everyone since their school days. A grand memorial was built at the site where the heroes died. Dozens of streets, parks, and districts in cities of the former USSR are named in their honor. The battle at the Dubosekovo rail siding has been included in all textbooks and became part of the Soviet canonical version of World War II. That would all be fine except for one problem. There never were any 28 Panfilov men. This story was completely made up. In this episode, we'll talk about what really happened at the Dubosekovo rail siding in November 1941. Who was behind the myth of the 28 Panfilov soldiers? And why did the Prosecutor General's office of the USSR become interested in this case after the war? You will also learn how modern Russia is trying to revive the Soviet myth and use it for ideological indoctrination of society. My name is Semyon. This is Megashow TV. Let's begin. There is nowhere to retreat. Moscow is behind us, or that's the classic version of the myth. November 1941. Undoubtedly, the most difficult period in the history of the Soviet Union. At that time, the fate of the country was literally hanging by a thread. By this time, the enemy had already occupied Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, and a significant part of the RSFSR. The Red Army had suffered losses unprecedented in military history. After the defeat in the Battle of Smolensk and the Vyazma disaster, the Nazis were approaching Moscow. It seemed that the fate of the Soviet capital was sealed. The Nazis wanted to encircle the city by outflanking it with massive attacks from the north and south. On November 15, the Germans, deploying a large number of armored vehicles, launched an offensive in the Volokholamsk area. Blocking this attack was General Panfilov's division, which was mainly composed of residents from the Kyrgyz and Kazakh SSR. The division was formed after the war had already begun. Its personnel numbered 11,500 people. It was additionally reinforced with artillery. The division commander, Major General Panfilov, who was the military commissar of the Kyrgyz SSR before the war, had real combat experience from World War I and the Civil War, participated in the Polish campaign, and suppressed anti-Bolshevik uprisings in Central Asia. So far, we are only talking about facts that are documented and do not raise any particular doubts. Well, now let's move on to the myth itself. It says that on November 16, 28, men from the 4th Company of the 1075th Rifle Regiment, led by political commissar Vasily Klochkov, held the line against the advancing Nazis in the area of the Dubosekovo rail siding 7 kilometers southeast of Volokholamsk. In this section of the front, the Germans used about 50 tanks and a large number of troops. During the hours-long battle, the heroic Panfilov men allegedly destroyed 18 tanks, but every single one of them died. The phrase of political commissar Klochkov said before the battle became legendary. Russia is great, but there is nowhere to retreat. Moscow is behind us. There is also mention of a traitor, apparently the 29th man who got scared and wanted to surrender to the Germans, but was immediately shot by his own comrades. How this was known if everyone died is of course unclear, but that's beside the point. The whole country first learned about the feat of the Panfilov soldiers near Dubosekovo from an article by the frontline correspondent Vasily Karateev, published in Red Star on November 27, 1941. It did not mention the names of the heroes or their number, it simply said that they fought heroically. Every single one of them died, but they did not let the enemy through. The commander of the detachment was identified as a certain Commissar Diev. Literally the next day, in the same Red Star newspaper, a whole front-page article was published, this time authored by the newspaper's secretary, Alexander Krivitsky. Here, for the first time, the number that later became canonical appeared: 28 Panfilov men. On January 22, 1942, the journalist published another article where he listed the names of the fallen heroes and once again described their feat in detail. Krivitsky is the main creator of the myth about the battle near Dubosekovo Junction. Articles about the feat of the 28 Panfilov soldiers received a wide response in Soviet society, both in the army and on the home front. The fallen heroes were avenged on all fronts. Their feat truly became a standard of military courage. In April 1942, the command of the Western Front petitioned the People's Commissar of Defense to award all the soldiers who died near Dubosekovo the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. It seemed like the matter was settled, but this story took a very unusual turn. The Panfilov heroes under investigation. In November 1947, the prosecutor's office of the Kharkiv region arrested a certain Ivan Dobrobabin for collaborating with the German occupiers. He was taken prisoner, after which he served as the chief of police in the temporarily occupied territory of the Kharkiv region. In 1943, he was arrested by Soviet law enforcement agencies, but he escaped and went back to the Germans, where he continued working as a policeman, participating in the forced deportation of Soviet citizens to work in Germany. So what do the Panfilov men have to do with this, you might ask? At that time, there were thousands of similar cases. Well, yes and no. The thing is, Ivan Dobrobabin was listed as one of the 28 Panfilov men, a hero who died 6 years ago near the Dubosekovo rail siding and was posthumously awarded the highest Soviet honor. They even found a book about the Panfilov heroes in Dobrobabin's possession. During the interrogation, the former policeman stated that he really did take part in the battle near Dubosekovo, but he didn't perform any heroic deeds there. He was lightly wounded and then captured. He also said that he read about his own heroism in Krivitsky's book with great interest. For his adventures, the fake hero received 15 years in the camps with confiscation of property. Even earlier, another Panfilov hero appeared, Danil Kujabergenov, about whom Red Star wrote, "Kujabergenov walks straight into the enemy machine gun's line of fire, arms crossed on his chest, and falls dead." In reality, he not only survived, but also ended up under investigation. In May 1942, he was arrested on charges of voluntarily surrendering to the enemy. During the investigation, Kujabergenov also stated that he only knew about his supposed feat near Dubosekovo from newspaper reports and had nothing to add. Following Dobrobabin and Kujabergenov, 3 more Panfilov heroes emerged from oblivion. Moreover, some of them had the audacity to demand their hero's star, which had been awarded posthumously. A major scandal with very unpleasant consequences was brewing. After all, by that time, the Panfilov men had already entered the Soviet pantheon of heroes, and every citizen of the USSR knew about their feats. And now, it turned out that not only were they alive, but they had also disgraced themselves by surrendering and collaborating with the Nazis. The USSR Prosecutor General's office took the case. During the investigation, journalists and writers involved in creating the myth of the 28 Panfilov guardsmen were questioned, as well as eyewitnesses and participants of those events. It quickly became clear that everything written in the articles and books was nothing more than fiction. This is exactly what the investigation's conclusions state. The feat of the 28 Panfilov guardsmen, widely covered in the press, is a fabrication by correspondent Karativ, editor of Red Star Artenberg, and especially the newspaper's literary secretary Krivitsky. Prosecutor General Safonov reported the investigation results directly to Zhdanov. The documents remain in the archives. Therefore, those at the top knew perfectly well what really happened on November 16, 1941, near the Dubosekovo rail siding. However, they decided not to make a scandal out of it. The case materials were classified. Books and articles about the 28 Panfilov soldiers continued to be published, as if nothing had happened. At the memorial on the site of the supposed battle, schoolchildren were inducted into the pioneers. Rallies were held on May 9th. The complaints of the resurrected Panfilov soldiers, as well as the very fact of their existence, were apparently simply ignored. What really happened? General Panfilov's division, more than 10,000 people, really did fight near Moscow in the Volokolamsk area. On November 16, 1941, at the Dubosekovo rail siding, soldiers of the 4th Company's 2nd Battalion 1075th Rifle Regiment of Panfilov's division really did repel a tank attack by the Nazis. But there weren't 28 of them. There were about 140 people, and indeed, many died in this battle. And it's no wonder, because all 140 people had only 4 anti-tank rifles, and the main weapons the soldiers used to destroy tanks were grenades and Molotov cocktails. That's not much for destroying dozens of German tanks. The Germans on this part of the front advanced with 2 tank divisions and 2 infantry divisions. The main blow fell on the junction between Panfilov's division and General Davato's cavalry corps. The 1075th Rifle Regiment repelled the first enemy assault, destroying 6 tanks. However, by 4 o'clock the defense had already been crushed, and the remaining soldiers were forced to retreat to new positions. There weren't many of them left. Only 25 men remained from the 4th Company. Still, in just 2 days, the 1075th Rifle Regiment lost about 400 men killed, 100 wounded, and 60 missing in action. For abandoning their positions and suffering heavy losses, the regiment commander Koprov and the commissar Mukhamedyarov were removed from their posts. At the same time, on November 16th, the entire regiment managed to destroy 15 German tanks. Later, however, these were credited to the 28 heroic Panfilov soldiers invented by the Red Star. The commander of the 1075th Regiment, Ilya Koprov, stated the following during interrogation, I quote, "There was no battle between the 28 Panfilov soldiers and German tanks at Dubosekovo Junction on November 16, 1941. This is complete fiction." On that day, at the Dubosekovo Junction, it was the 4th Company of the 2nd Battalion that fought against the German tanks, and they truly fought heroically. More than 100 people from the company were killed, not 28 as the newspapers wrote. According to Koprov, none of the correspondents approached him during that period, and he never told anyone about the battle of the 28 Panfilov men. In fact, he couldn't have talked about it, because such a battle simply never happened. Koprov also stated that he doesn't know what materials the articles in the Red Book are based on. Koprov first heard about the 28 Panfilov men at the end of December 1941, when a correspondent from Red Star, Krivitsky, came to their regiment along with representatives of the division's political department. In a conversation with Koprov, the journalist directly stated that he needed 28 Panfilov guardsmen who would fight against German tanks. To this, Koprov replied that the whole regiment fought against the tanks, and he didn't know anything about a battle involving 28 guardsmen. Captain Gundelovich gave Krivitsky the soldiers' names for the list from memory. So how was the myth born? Why did the Red Star write about 28 Panfilov soldiers and not 43 or 70? After all, they could have simply said how heroically General Panfilov's division fought, which is confirmed not only by archival documents, but also by dozens of eyewitnesses. In mid-November 1941, correspondent Karateev was sent to the front. But he wasn't allowed to the front lines because it was real hell there, yet he still needed to bring material back to the editorial office. And then he heard from Commissar Yegorov of the Panfilov division about an understrength company that fought heroically at the Dubosekovo Junction and died to the last man. There were also 2 traitors in the story who tried to defect to the Germans, but they were supposedly shot by their own men. Yegorov himself, however, was not present at the battle. He learned about it from the commissar of the 1075th Regiment. However, he also wasn't at the scene of the battle and heard about it from someone else. When Karateev told this story to editor-in-chief Artenberg, he asked him how many people could have been in this battle-worn company. Karateev replied, well, about 30 people. Minus 2 traitors, that's how it ended up being 28 Panfilov heroes. But later, Artenberg and Karateev decided that having 2 traitors out of 30 people was a bit too much. So in the canonical version of the myth, there's only 1 traitor. Well, then the literary secretary of Red Star, Krivitsky, got involved and depicted all this in a literary form. During the interrogation, Krivitsky was directly asked where he got the famous words supposedly said by political commissar Klochkov, "Russia is vast, but there's nowhere to retreat. Moscow is behind us." Without hesitation, he replied that he came up with them himself. He also admitted to the investigator that after the battle, he did not speak with any of the wounded or surviving soldiers in Panfilov's division. However, in the 1970s, Alexander Krivitsky said that he was allegedly pressured in the prosecutor's office. They promised that if he did not admit that his story about the 28 Panfilov soldiers was made up, he would be sent to Kolyma. It is unclear why the investigators needed to do this. The myth about the Panfilov soldiers fit perfectly into the general pattern of Soviet propaganda about World War II, so why pressure its creators? Moreover, the testimonies of other witnesses to the events clearly proved that the story about the 28 heroes who stopped 50 tanks was a fabrication from beginning to end. The newest falsifiers of history. The legend of the 28 Panfilov soldiers lasted until the very end of the Soviet Union. Only in the early 1990s, when the archives began to open, did society learn the truth. It would seem that this topic could be put to rest forever, but it turned out that wasn't the case. In 2009, filming began in Russia for the movie 28 Panfilov Men, based on the very Soviet myth invented by the journalists of Red Star. The Russian Ministry of Culture and the Ministry of Culture of Kazakhstan joined in financing the project. The film premiered on November 16, 2016 in Volokholamsk. After that, it was released in all Russian cinemas. And here, Sergei Mironenko, the director of the State Archive of Russia, played a dirty trick on the creators of this propaganda opus. At the World Congress of Russian Press in Moscow, he publicly called the story of the 28 Panfilov men a myth. This happened in 2015 when the filming of the movie was in full swing and serious funds had already been invested in it. Moreover, the archive had declassified the report of the chief military prosecutor Nikolai Afanasyev to Zhdanov. Yes, from that very post-war investigation. It was clearly stated there that the Battle of the 28 Panfilov men is a myth invented by Soviet journalists. And you can't argue with that, because it's not an article by some modern slanderer of history working off dirty State Department money, but an official document created back in Soviet times, which was also classified as top secret for more than 60 years. It's no surprise that Mironenko's actions caused a real outcry among Russian conservatives. The Russian Minister of Culture Medinsky called those who attacked the sacred legend complete scum. On another occasion, he said that such people would burn in hell. There was no less of an uproar on social media and in the blogosphere. The scholar, who simply introduced the public to an authentic historical document, began to be openly called a Russophobe and an agent of the West. It turns out that in modern Russia, any attempt to understand one's own history, to see mistakes and crimes in order not to repeat them, is called Russophobia. The worst part is that this approach is supported by the overwhelming majority of Russians today. In conclusion, military propaganda is an extremely cruel and ruthless thing. It is primarily aimed at its own citizens, who are being turned into obedient, soulless cogs of war. To do this, the most primitive and base instincts in people will be awakened. However, when peacetime comes, this frenzy fades away and it becomes time for professional historians to do their work. That's how it happens in normal countries, at least. In the USSR and now in the Russian Federation, this is a problem. You'd think, why touch the old Soviet military myth about the Panfilov men, when the history of the Soviet-German war? The war is already full of real acts of heroism, isn't it? Take the same Battle of Moscow, for example. Study it and make a good movie about real heroes. But somehow it just isn't working out yet. Well, never mind, that's all from me. Goodbye, everyone.